William Styron, an acclaimed award-winning author of books you've probably heard of, The Confessions of Nat Turner and Sophie's Choice, a great author, at the age of 62 experienced a profound bout of severe depression. Here he is at the height of his success, financial and professional. He entered an experience, as he describes it, of a brain under siege. Panic and dislocation, a sense that his thought processes were being engulfed by a toxic and unnameable tide that obliterated any enjoyable response to the living world. In a radio interview, Styron described this disease. I think the closest I've ever been able to hit upon an analogous pain is that of suffocation, or of being in prison in an intensely hot room from which there is no escape. It is that kind of sort of diabolical discomfort. And he describes the annihilation of any sense of self-worth, the fear he felt of abandonment, and states, it is hopelessness even more than the pain that crushes the soul. He wrestled with depression, the severe depression, for over 3 years. But he wrote a book about his experiencing, describing this experience, titled A Darkness Visible, a memoir of madness. And he wrote it to help others who have not experienced serious depression to know what it is like for the sufferer. Because he argues, unless one has experienced such depression, one cannot really fully understand what's happening inside a person, that they are like a walking casualty of war, thrust into the most intolerable social and family situations. And that when they are there, they must, despite the anguish devouring their brain, present a face, as he says, approximating one that is associated with ordinary events and companionship. That they must try to utter small talk and be responsive to questions and knowingly nod and frown, and God help them, he says, they're supposed to smile. Now, Styron is unsure why this darkness visible came upon him. He suspects, as he reflects on it, mostly to do with his brain chemistry, with some hormones. He suspects that when he had given up drinking years before, of a lifetime of heavy drinking, that it may have masked, his drinking may have masked this depression that was always at the core of his being. In reflecting back, he says he thinks depression had been knocking at his door for many, many years. But why he was depressed is not the question at the heart of his book. He wants to describe what it feels like so that people who have good hearts, good desires, good motives, cannot simply tell the depressed person that they just need to pull themselves out of the darkness by dint of their will, or they just need to do something fun to feel better. Or, God forbid, that good-intentioned people might make people blame the very person for the darkness they are experiencing. None of these so-called encouraging words, encouraging strategies helped him. The only thing he said that sustained him was that someone was willing to sit in the darkness with him. Now, the prayer that is Psalm 139 is a human expression of an experience of God, both mysterious and moving. It is, I think, the best summation of grace in the Bible. It is an affirmation that God knows us more profoundly than we even know ourselves. It is an affirmation that there is no place where God's hand will not reach out to lead us, to keep us, to hold us. And it is an affirmation that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And how can one not be caught up in that beautiful language? Where can I flee from your spirit? Where can I hide from your presence? If I climb to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the pit of darkness, the word here is Sheol, this image of hell. Even if I make my bed in hell, you are there. Good times and bad times, you are there. How many of you have heard of Saint Ignatius? Is anybody here? Ignatius was a man back in the Middle Ages, about 1500s, 1600s, who wanted to be a warrior and then was injured in a battle and then had to convalesce. And as he lay convalescing, picked up a book about the saints and began to read it, picked up the Bible and began to read it, and had this conversion. And he became, eventually, to found the society known as the Jesuits. My Jesuit friends kind of joke with me that we Presbyterians are Jesuits of the Protestants. In other that we're, in part because we're so focused on social justice and faith and spirituality and the intellectual life. But Ignatius then formed what are called these spiritual exercises of Ignatius, which actually was a 4-week series of spiritual exercises. They very intensive spiritual exercises. You can do this these days and participate in these spiritual exercises, usually over a longer period of time. But these spiritual exercises were to help people discern God's Spirit, the movement of God's Spirit, where God was in their life and where God wasn't. And these exercises are very powerful and meaningful ways to kind of attune oneself to who God is. And one of the things that Ignatius commented on or pointed out, he says every human being has these experiences. One is consolation, these periods of consolation, these periods where everything's going good, right? Where everything feels good, where you're feeling joy, you're not hitting any slices or hooks, you're hitting it right down the fairway. It's great. And he calls those periods of time consolation. And those are most often gifts from God. Meaningful gifts from God and should be enjoyed. But he said every human being also experiences what he called desolation. And there are a number of sources for desolation. In some instances, desolation are experiences in a profound darkness, as Styron describes those times when we are really down and the world doesn't seem to work and we feel lost and alone. Often that can be related, some of the source of that desolation can be related to our own human brokenness, a sense in which we kind of make the same mistakes and hurt ourselves and those around them. That could be a source of those periods of desolation. But he also says, and again in his time he uses the language of the devil, but he says sometimes desolation comes because we have no control over it whatsoever. It can be the state of the world. We could find ourselves struggling with the brokenness in the world and how that desolates us and sinks us into the pit of darkness. But then he says, but there are times of desolation that are actually important and meaningful spaces, what spiritual writers call the dark night of the soul, periods in which, in that desolation, we discover the faithfulness of God. That in many ways, that is when our faith deepens and grows. In those places, in those spaces, we might discover a God we did not expect to see. In the darkness, the psalm says, God finds us. Now, I'm convinced, as I've been wrestling with some of these questions about the gospel and mental health, and the word that keeps coming to me each and every Sunday when we talk about grace is the importance, the centrality of community, of connection between us and between each other. It's in community that we experience grace and hope and healing. It's in community that we find each other even in the midst of darkness. It is in community that we are Christ to one another. It is in community that we are an embodiment of grace to each other. Styron claimed the darkness visible, that the reality is that the ones sitting in the darkness with him were those his community, who got him through. And they did so not by giving explanations for what was happening, not arguing theology or reasons. But the ones sitting in the darkness with him that got him through were not the ones who were trying to solve the unsolvable. And especially, they were not the ones who were judging. They were simply the ones holding him. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.